Good day, everybody. And first of all, a happy Father's Day to all the dads out there who hopefully some of them will be listening to this webcast. This is Two Guys, One Car, Episode 3, Electric Bugaloo. And the topics today, we got some interesting ones. The first one is going to be there was a UAW vote at Volkswagen in Tennessee, so we'll discuss that. Then we're going to talk about reproduction cars because there was a new one announced this week. Reproduction cars, is there a point? Third topic is going to be all about horsepower, specifically V8s in the EU. They are going to be regulated out of existence, specifically the LT1 used in the Corvette and the Camaro. So we'll talk about V8s and their future. Fourth topic will be hybrids in racing, kind of a good segue, because a couple series this week announced that they are going to be going hybrid in the next couple of years. And that's really kind of interesting because a few years ago, nobody wanted to be hybrid. And then the final topic for today is going to be NASCAR and their current rules package. Is it working? Is it good for the racing? Is it good for the fans? Is it good for the drivers? Or is it just a giant mess that nobody seems to figure out? And before we get into any of that, the 24 Hours of Le Mans just ended. I'll just say congratulations to Toyota for curb stomping the entire field once again.
By that you mean not breaking down.
Yeah, I mean,
literally all they had to do.
Yeah, and to be fair, keep it on the island. I mean, there's 60 other cars in the field that they're trying to avoid. So, I mean, it's not a walk in the park, but when you don't really have any major competition breathing down your neck, it is kind of somewhat of a hollow victory, but it's still a victory at Le Mans. Sebastian Buemi, Kazuki Nakajima, and Fernando Alonso won. They were actually not the leading Toyota. The leading Toyota thought they had a puncture, and then they had to pit twice to find out that they didn't have a puncture. They just had a broken tire pressure sensor. So that was kind of a bit of a screw up, but that's kind of typical Toyota too. And then I actually haven't even seen who did well in the GT category.
Ferrari won in GT.
Ferrari. Ferrari!
In the actual competitive division.
Yeah, where you have Corvettes and Ferraris and Ford GTs and Porsches and Aston Martins. So, it's...
Now, Curly, I think enough about that. I'm going to jump us right into V-dub and the UA-dub.
Oh, God. Well, clearly it's Father's Day because here's Tom leading off with the dad jokes.
Goddamn right.
So, yeah, let's go ahead and get into that. So the UAW, Union of Auto Workers, right? They're probably
United Auto Union or United Auto Workers.
Okay, United Auto Workers. I knew it was one of those two. Probably one of the most well-known unions in the United States outside of maybe the teachers union and probably a couple of others. And in many ways, they represent both what's really good about unions and what's terrible about unions. So on the good side, the whole point of unions is that they fight for worker rights. They fight for, they use collective bargaining, collective negotiations to improve working conditions, get more benefits, and get proper raises for their workers. And in that sense, the UAW really works. Even today, in today's economy, where being a manufacturer and being a line worker is not the most lucrative field in the world, you can support a family working at a Ford or Chrysler plant or a GM plant if you're part of the UAW. On the other hand, Tom, you have worked with the UAW, and you know all of the downsides of those gains that the UAW has fought for.
So the UAW is a really, really interesting thing. I'm going to preface this with I am absolutely not anti-union, and I think a lot of the things that UAW does is good. That being said, I think the UAW is probably the worst example of how a union can be ran, and it is a great example of a union that has grown to gain way too much power. They've done a lot of really good things. Like you mentioned being able to support a family, but to that point, those line workers are actually paid really well. Most union auto workers are being paid roughly a little bit more than most engineers get paid when they start. So they are getting paid very well.
So
But
that's about what, $25 an hour or so.
I think the going rate's 28.
Okay, so $28
That was,
an hour, and
but that was
you
4
can,
years ago.
okay, well, we'll stick with that. So we can round up $30 an hour for a relatively unskilled job. I mean, you do get trained on the machine, but you don't have to have, you can have that job with a high school degree compared to working at, most big chains where you're going to make minimum wage, maybe $8 or $9 an hour. Even compare that to Amazon, where they're making a big hoopla about paying their workers $15 an hour. So you can work in an Amazon warehouse for $15 an hour, work weird hours, weird shifts, get no benefits, or you could work for Ford or GM or Chrysler and get twice that with a proper schedule and with vacation and health insurance and all those other good things.
Now there are caveats to that though, because they are paid very well, but there's a couple negatives here.
Mm-hmm.
One is that union dues for the UAW are not cheap. They are on the area of thousands a year, I believe. It's not cheap to be in the auto union, and one of the biggest issues I've seen with them is if you meet a union worker in the UAW, chances are they're in their 40s or 50s. They're older, middle-aged. You rarely meet younger UAW members, and that's one of the issues that the UAW is trying to resolve, but I don't think they understand how they can resolve it because they are just not getting young people to join. And the issue to this point is no matter what the UAW does in their negotiations, that was one of the things that was good about working in the auto industry, because if you worked for an OEM after the UAW negotiations were finished, you got a lot of those benefits. A lot of those benefits trickled up to engineering and management and everybody else. They just kept carrying that over for simplicity. Now, that's a lot of good things for us engineers, but on the other hand, line workers are losing their jobs. And the UAW has, as great as it is that they're getting their wages increased, like you said, I'm not saying these jobs are easy, not at all, but they can be done in Mexico. They can be done in Canada. They can be done for cheaper. And that's part of the nature of the US economy. And we won't get into the economics of that. But the UAW has somewhat priced themselves out of the market. And I think that's why you see companies like VW, like Tesla, like all these other companies trying to keep the UAW out of their plants because they're trying to pay their workers a reasonable wage to keep their cars at a reasonable price so that they can have jobs in America but not have to deal with all the crap of the UAW that is potential strikes every 2 years, I believe.
Yeah,
Every
whenever
two,
the contract negotiations come up.
yeah, every 2 years, the UAW literally threatens a strike. They do not go into negotiations friendly. It's ugly. Every 2 years, they threaten strikes. They come in hot, and that works in a way, but that has always kept everything a little bit awkward between union and non-union people at all these OEMs. At FCA, it was a lot more integrated than it was at GM, where a lot of the designers that I worked with were union, and some of them were really nice, but some of the union guys are also extremely paranoid because they're always afraid of losing their jobs, even though literally all the union's number one job is to give them security with their jobs. So, but they're always paranoid to lose it. We would get yelled at for having a screwdriver. We were not allowed to work on cars in the garages ourselves because we had to write up a work order and wait for a union guy to be assigned to and do it. A few good examples of this were when I was like swapping seats on a Wrangler, which by the way is not difficult. It's 4 bolts and a plug on the front, and it's two bolts on the back. It's not hard, and I would have to wait at least a day or two to get a union worker assigned so that he can do the job. and this is something I could have done in 5 minutes in a parking lot.
Hmm.
So that's just like a small snippet of the UAW, but I think the biggest thing is that they're pricing themselves out of the market. And another thing the UAW loves to do is this a really old school mentality is they love overtime. They love to stretch out everything so that because they get paid by the hour, if they stretch everything out and they end up with that overtime, they get paid more. So that costs the company more. And that's part of the toxic nature, I think, of America as a whole, where we love overtime way too much. And I think that causes massive burnout. But the way the UAW goes about it, a lot of times, and these are just my observations, I'm not saying this as a blanket statement, but a
Hmm.
lot of UAW workers, because of their high hourly wage, want overtime so they can get paid more. And
Is
that's tough.
there overtime time and a half, or is it just
Yes,
additional?
sir.
Okay. Yeah. So that's actually you made the comment about how it's sort of an issue in America with loving overtime and burnout, which I agree. That's definitely an issue. But sort of overtime in general for hourly workers is, it's desirable because, again, as you said, for a lot of times it's time and a half. So you take that $30, it's now $45 an hour, and there's usually limits on overtime at most companies. But even if you're saying it's just five hours, you're doing 5 hours of work and getting 7.5, 8 hours of pay. So you know it's not free money, but it certainly helps the bank account. And the issue with that becomes when you do hit a recession and the company clamps down on the overtime and you've been living off of that. And that's actually an issue with a lot of hourly workers, is that they will budget based on their overtime. They don't budget based on, oh, this is just additional to what I already had. And then that overtime gets cut, and all of a sudden you're now at a budget deficit personally. So that's certainly an issue. Now, I am in a non-union state. Kentucky is in fact a right to work state. If you don't know what right to work is, the simple explanation is you are not required to join a union if you don't want to. So if there's a union shop that's already set up, whether it's a metal worker or teachers or whatever, you are not forced to join. So one of the big uh, tactics that the UAW especially had, and all unions for that matter, for a long time, was they if you uh, joined a company that had a union, you were almost forced to sign up for that union. They basically made it really difficult for you to work in that building without joining the union. And part of that was to try to keep a united front. That's unions need the membership in order to get the collective bargaining. If 80% of your workforce is union and they threaten to strike, that's going to hurt your business. If it's only 30 or 40%, yeah, go ahead and strike. We'll just fire you, and we'll replace you with new workers, or there's some derogatory terms for them, but we'll hire temp workers instead. So right to work has gutted union memberships because, okay, I can go to, and actually that's the other half of it. So right to work is you don't have to join the union, but you can get union benefits. So if the union negotiates say a $1 an hour raise, as a non-union worker, you can get that raise too. The company can give it to you, and you don't pay the dues. So you get the benefits of the union, but you don't have to pay their dues. And it's a sneaky tactic to undercut the unions, and it sadly works. So Kentucky is pretty much a non-union state, partly because of that law. And actually, it's kind of interesting because I'm very much in favor of unions. They have, just in general, again, the UAW is probably one of the most well-known unions, but in general, unions um, they do good. They fight for worker rights. They get benefits. They get pay. Um, they improve working conditions. Unions were originally created in the teens and 20s, the 19 teens and 20s, 100 years ago, to stop things like child labor and forced overtime, and the whole idea of you don't get to go home if we don't want you to, or working in horrifically unsafe environments. Um, Unions were created to stop those kinds of just truly inhumane business practices. And yeah, we're in an era where those kinds of things don't happen anymore. But the real turning point of unions was in 1981, and Ronald Reagan. So PATCO, which was the air traffic controllers union, they wanted a pretty substantial raise, and they went on strike when the FAA refused to give it to them. And there's a lot of back and forth about how that strike went down. Officially, it was not legal. Government workers are not allowed to strike per a 1950s law, but they went on strike anyway. And the assumption was that no sane president would actually enforce that law. They would, negotiate and come to an agreement. Well, Ronald Reagan said you have 48 hours to get back to work. Out of the, I think, 11,000 or 18,000 air traffic controllers, only about a tenth of them actually showed up to work. So Ronald Reagan fired the rest of them. And first of all, it should be noted that while there were no incidents due to the strike and due to the temporary workers, it took about a decade before air traffic resumed its pre-strike and pre-firing levels. But at that point, so it's always been legal to fire striking workers, but it was never socially acceptable. So if you were a company that fired your striking workers and hired temps, or even just hired temps in general, that was usually frowned upon. And that would be very unpopular, both politically and economically. But once the president of the United States does it, all bets are off. And basically, ever since then, unions have lost a lot of their bargaining power because, again, if they strike, okay, we'll just hire more workers because there's always more in the queue. So, that the PATCO strike happened, and then that's when you start seeing wage stagnation. So for 40 years almost, the United States has seen wage stagnation because unions, there's no collective bargaining anymore. Unions have shrunk since then. There have been multiple laws that have been designed to undercut unions, and it's working. And so the thing we do need to mention is that the UAW vote was on Friday. They tallied the votes, and by Saturday, the vote was turned down. So the VW plant in Tennessee is still going to be a non-union plant. It's not the first time they've tried to vote for a union down there, but again, it's failed. But it always raises a good point of where do unions fit in modern America? I do think they still have a place, especially as we see more and more companies moving to contract work. The best examples are like Uber and Lyft, and to an extent Amazon. Basically, anyone who hires you to do a gig job. It's not a full-time position. It is work at will. You can be fired at any point. You don't get any benefits. You don't have maximum hours. You don't have guaranteed breaks. There's no guaranteed vacation.
Can I build on that for a moment?
Sure, go right ahead.
We talked about John Oliver, you and I, and he went on a rant a while back informing everybody about the situation of wrestling and the WWE. And there's a really interesting union story behind that. I think he mentioned it. Back in the 80s,
he did. They tried to unionize.
Jesse Ventura tried to unionize wrestlers in the 80s, and that was essentially shot down by Hulk Hogan, who was like up here and everyone else was down here. So he did not need the union, therefore he basically stomped out the plan, probably literally, Jesse Ventura's plan to unionize those wrestlers. And I think that's somewhere where unions are really helpful, like Uber, like wrestling, even the NFL, NHL. I think those unions there, they are okay, but they're kind of pathetic. The NFLPA is probably one of the biggest jokes on the planet. They
Just
they
like the
fail.
NFL.
They constantly fail the players. It's still a ridiculously dangerous sport where they don't get benefits after they retire. The NFLPA tries to fight it, but in the end, they still can't take on a big company. And that's kind of telling to a lot of unions right now, because a lot of unions are really struggling to take on these companies. Do they help? Sure. Sure, they do. But in some situations, the UAW being one of them, they have grown almost too big for their britches. Some unions, great, but the UAW has grown and they need new leadership. They need it badly because they don't understand the struggle of modern America. And I and that's a problem. There are all these 60-year-old dudes that are trying to fight for the same things that they fought for in the 80s, and those aren't the things you need to be fighting for anymore. You can't
Can you give
have.
any examples of that?
So one of the biggest things I've noticed is a loophole that's actually been exploited recently, and that is the plant closures in Detroit, Lordstown, Ohio, and Baltimore from GM. They've explicitly put in the contract that they are not allowed to do anything. They have to assign at the beginning of a UAW contract what the union plants are, what is going to be in them, and if any, they can't change anything without union approval, be it idling, be it, or actually I don't think they prevent idling anymore, but they essentially can't close the plant without UAW approval. And GM exploited a loophole that is I think they used some sort of wording that was like temporarily idling, but with no plan to build anything new. So essentially, they fired the workers, and that's one of the things that the UAW has a problem with. I think is that it's impossible to fire a union worker, be it the best worker on the planet or the worst worker on the planet. It is impossible to fire them. That can sometimes bring down quality. And I with you and I, Curly, we can be fired almost any time for almost
Yep,
any reason.
we are at will employees.
We are at will employees. So we know this and we accept this. And while it's great having job security, I think the union tries way too hard to have extreme job security, and I don't think that works very well anymore. It's really tough for a company to be able to see 2, 4 years down the line and be able to say, yes, this plant is absolutely still going to be viable in 2 years. I'm not going to have to take a break for a year with this plant or retool it for a new vehicle. It's very difficult these days with how much the market shifts, with how much with how much car sales slip, that you have to employ all these people this many hours at this many plants. It's tough. And I understand where the companies are coming from. I understand where the unions are coming from, but this is a really tough discussion right now to have that much job security, as good as it is.
So it sounds like what you want to see is number one, some fresh perspective on the UAW side, not just you know the same old people stuck in their ways who don't seem to understand the bigger picture. It also sounds like you want to see the UAW take part in serious negotiations that, well, if anything, it almost sounds like you want the UAW to have more involvement in the company decisions so that they understand how they work and understand how they fit into the puzzle, not to bully the OEM into, oh, we want, this, that, and the other, but to understand here's the situation of the company itself. Here's how you fit into it, and what actually basically understand how the company works so they actually have a better idea of how to negotiate for the best long-term future of their workers, which isn't necessarily higher wages and more vacation, but it is true competitive job security. So being more at will with firings, maybe have a bit of a pay cut, but essentially have a proper contract of, okay, we will, based on our forecast, we can keep you around for this long. It's a guaranteed job as opposed to you get $30 an hour, but you might be idle and then get nothing for a year.
Well, but right now that almost rarely happens because they don't when they even when they idle plants, they still pay workers something. It's some sort of percentage,
Hmm.
and
But
again,
it's still not a full. But would you rather, if you're in that situation, would you rather have a known job for 3 years and then one of these years might be idle where you're only making, say, 50% of your wage? Or would you rather have 2 years of guaranteed you will be working at this plant? We know we're going to keep this, excuse me, we know we're going to keep this model for the next 2 years. And then, whatever the negotiation is, even really yearly, say, okay, we know that we're going to make these models at this plant for the next year. You will still have a job at, maybe your current rate, not a raise.
that's an interesting point actually. I think yearly might be a big step up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's impossible with the current leadership in the UAW right now because of how intense I've mentioned the negotiations are. These aren't easy. And with a lack of better words, I think the UAW needs a little bit of chill. I I think they need to come in, they need to not be so aggressive because these companies right now, the economy is difficult, especially right now as we've been dodging a recession for years and the companies are scared, so they're wondering what to do. And we got another union contract coming up soon. And every 2 years, if you have to enter these aggressive negotiations instead of maybe some shorter, simpler negotiations every year, then you might have more clarity on what can be at these plants, what's selling, what's not selling. Will we possibly have to transfer? Something like that.
So I have two sort of final questions for you then. The first is, do you see a situation where, so we've already sort of established that we think, or at least you think, the UAW is too big for their britches. They're too powerful, and yet I think you've also mentioned here that they're losing a lot of membership. They're not gaining new members. Their old members are retiring or being laid off. Do you see a situation where someone like Ford or GM, they find a way to deunionize?
I think if
And if
anyone,
if so, when would you see that?
I think if anyone does it, it's GM. I think it's
Okay.
I think it's absolutely just from pure speculation, I think if anyone would do it, it's GM. And I think it's because they fractured the relationship so badly this year.
Hmm.
When they shut down Lordstown, the UAW has a lawsuit out against GM for both essentially shutting down the Lordstown plant, and also they hired scab workers, or that's the derogatory term you mentioned,
Replacement
but
workers.
replacement workers. Yes, that's politically correct. They they have two lawsuits out against GM right now, and by the way, they're coming into negotiations, so that's kind of difficult to start negotiating when you kind of have two lawsuits against you. GM, we've seen them start to cut down on their models. Uh, I think there is a chance that if it were anyone, I think it would be GM because they've started to shut down a lot of union plants already. They're not afraid to fight the union. So I do think there's a chance that GM might deunionize.
Okay. And you think that would be in the next round of negotiations,
I
or is it going to be further down the road?
I think the next round of negotiations are going to be really interesting.
Hmm.
The biggest thing they've got is the truck plant. Whether they can get replacement workers for the truck plant
Hmm.
if they were to deunionize.
Interesting. All right. So let's say that they do deunionize and all those UAW workers are out of a job. Do you think that they will go and start building reproduction Camaros and Corvettes and Chevelles? So horrible, horrible segue, but reproduction cars. So this week, a company in the UK announced that they're going to start building reproductions of the Ford Escort Mark II rally car, which is a truly iconic rally car. It was one of the more successful rear-wheel drive rally cars. I've heard stories where it was a car where you drove it so sideways, you, instead of looking through the windshield, when you were going through a corner, you were actually looking at the back side window because that's how far around you had to get the car to rotate to give it speed. And even today, it's still a really popular car to rally. So again, this is an aftermarket company in the UK. They're starting with brand new bodies, stamped in 2019, and then they're going to build them up into essentially classic rally cars. And when I first read about this, it actually really pissed me off. First of all, because I admit I only glanced at the headline. I went, "Oh God damn it, Ford is doing this," because this sort of follows up the Aston Martin DB4 GT Zagato and the DB5 Goldfinger edition. Those are both being built and sold by Aston Martin for ridiculous amounts of money. And they're just continuations, essentially, of iconic cars from 60 years ago. And in this case, in the case of both the Aston Martins, they're not road legal. They don't meet EU regulations. They don't meet UK regulations. So they are basically show cars only. And in the case of the DB4, they strictly made it a race car because they knew they could not make it road legal. So when I heard about this Escort, I went, another one of these things. Because I love, full disclosure, my favorite period of cars are Japanese cars from about 1985 to 2000. Those are the period of cars that I love the most. But I also want to say that doesn't mean that I think that anything made before 1985 or after 2000 is a bad car. There may not be cars in those periods that I truly love, but there are cars that are still great. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean that it's a bad car. And as we discussed last week, there's a brand new hypercar that I'm super excited about, even though I know Tom doesn't think it's ever going to actually exist. But, one of the things I really hate about sort of the car culture in general today is that there's very much a fixation on the past. If you go to a classic car meet, like a muscle car meet, you'll see a lot of cars from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then, basically once we hit the gas crisis, it sort of stops. And those are the type of people who they buy a brand new Chevy Blazer or an Equinox or whatever because they have to. But, in their minds, the last good car was built in 1973 and everything after that has been garbage. In the sort of racer community that I enjoy, basically once the GTR and the NSX and the Supra went out of production, and the Eclipse went front wheel drive, and the Civic Type R, or the Type R's are no longer sold in America. Or I should say the Honda got rid of their double wishbone suspension. Everything after that's terrible and garbage. And, the new Supra's a sellout and the GTR is fat and blah, blah, blah. But, those are also great. Those newer cars are great cars. They're just not those iconic 90s cars that like I grew up with and fell in love with. And I sort of hate that the idea of, oh, well, all the good cars are in the past. It's kind of the same idea as well. Nobody's made good music after 2000, which is just not true. So, when I first read this, it was like, oh, it's more of this, the ass kissing of nostalgia. It's a cash grab for people who think that the best cars have already been made, especially when, Ford currently makes the Fiesta as a rally car, a world rally car, and a rally cross car in Europe. But
I believe they've canceled that too.
Really? Oh, that's sad. But the Fiesta over the last 10 years has been one of the most successful rally type cars ever made. I mean, that thing just, if you put it on a dirt road or gravel road, it will kick ass. So it saddens me when people are super excited about an Escort Mark II reproduction, a car that went out of production almost 40 years ago. And yet there's a car that is currently in production that is not an icon because nobody's really thought to try to make it an icon, even though the Fiesta rally cars are awesome. So it feels like to me that there's more of an emphasis on keeping old icons alive and on life support than there is in creating new icons, which is kind of dumb because there's cars today that could be iconic, like the Mustang 350 or GT 350 today. That is an awesome car. That should be super iconic. Or, in some ways, the Dodge Demon is kind of an iconic car. It's a ridiculous car, but it's amazing at what it does. So yeah, I don't know. I've sort of changed my mind that I think this particular Escort is not as bad. And you know what? If you're going to make a rally car, at least make a new one. And then sort of continue on that idea of icons, V8s.
So wait, no,
Oh,
I'm not.
no,
I'm not
no.
letting you get away with that without me rebutting literally everything you just said.
Okay, go on then.
All right. So you complained about the Aston Martin DB4 Zagato being reproduced, and now I want to
Mhm.
ask you how much you think a DB4 Zagato, the real edition, how much you think that is worth, Curly?
God, those are probably like $5 or $6 million cars.
It is worth upwards of 13 million. So if you can get one
Hold
for
on, hold on. 30 or 13?
13,
Okay.
so if
So
you can
say
get
30, even 30 million for an Aston Martin is ridiculous. Even
so if you
13
can
is
get
kind of
that for
crazy.
if you can get that car for 300, 400K, that's not unreasonable. They're only going to make a few of them. There's not going to be that many. Not many people are going to buy them. I don't think that's a big deal. Yes,
So
old cars are too beloved, but if that very same company were to make a new rally car and say, "Hey, look, we made a rally car." They're like, "Okay." Unless you have Ken Block do a fun video about it, no one's gonna care.
okay, so here's my response to that. There are two copies of Star Wars, the original Star Wars movie on the shelf. One is a video cassette from 1975. The other is a video cassette when they re-released them in the 90s. Which are you going to pick up?
If they are the theatrical cut of
Yeah,
Star Wars,
theatrical
then
cut versus the CGI'd version.
because that's worth a lot of money, so I will grab that.
Let's just pretend for a second that they are exactly the same price. And I know that's kind of a stretch, but or I say you can afford to buy both of them. Which are you going to choose? Which is the one that you're going to buy and show off and be more proud of?
The theatrical.
Exactly. So if I'm in the market for a DB4 Zagato, and for the record, I am definitely not. I want to have the original, the actual icon, not the warmed over, hey, we made another one because, you know, we could. I want to have the original. It's kind of like a remake of an old car, and it's like the original is always going to be better. It's because the original has
Hard disagree there. Hard disagree.
okay. Agree to disagree. I will say though, I also, as much as I dislike the pandering to nostalgia fanatics, I also truly hate when someone takes a nice clean car and then chops it up into some ridiculous custom for no point. And actually, a good example of that is Ken Block, his Unicorn Mustang, an amazing Mustang. I love that car. That car is just badass as hell. But he took a beautiful cherry sky blue Mustang. I mean, really nice original car, and then completely destroyed it. And like, you know what? I appreciate what he did with that car. Like I said, that is an awesome car. It is total jewel worthy. But couldn't he have done that with like a barn find car? Like, because there's not a lot of original sheet metal left on that car. Everything's been modified and cut up. Like at that point, or even they make reproduction Mustang shells. Why not buy one of those? It seems like there's not a whole lot of Mustang left on that car. Why start with a full car when you could just start with a body? So like that's where I kind of think this Escort's not too terrible.
Well, and to finish here with your sort of icon status issue, I think the big problem with this is your 90s JDM cars, they are starting to become icons.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the biggest keys to becoming an icon is time.
Yes, yes,
So
yes, exactly.
the
Yeah,
Chevy
because
SS in the future might be an icon,
mm-hmm.
but it takes time.
And I think again the Demon and the GT350 will also become icons eventually. And you're right, it does take time. I remember the NSX when it went out of production. It was sort of like the whole like, oh, they even still make that car. It was kind of like a good riddance. And then the new one came out, or the new one was announced. Actually, it's funny. Originally, the new one was announced like a year after the old one went out of production, and then they didn't actually build it for another decade. But like if you went back like 5 or 6 years ago, you could get a good, clean first generation NSX for $25,000, give or take. Maybe 2 owners, 150,000 miles. I mean, it's a Honda; it's going to run forever. But you could get a good, clean NSX for that amount, and you could even find them under 20 grand. If you try to do that now, it's not possible. I mean, you look on Bring a Trailer, and a single owner NSX is going for like 100 grand, or the single owner Supras that are going for $100,000. It's like Supras for a long time were super disposable because they were, that was a car that really, people forget that car sold terribly when it was new because it was way too expensive. And it kind of got forgotten, and then people realized, oh, hey, you can make ridiculous amounts of horsepower with this engine. And the Fast and the Furious came out and kind of reminded people, hey, this is actually a pretty good car. So yeah, you're right. It's going to take time, but again, it's the whole sort of pandering to these cars that have already come and gone. So
that's always going to happen, and I guarantee in about 10, 15 years, there are going to be nostalgia for the cars from the early 2000s. Now, speaking of nostalgia and cars that sell like shit, the Camaro and the Corvette in Europe, or not in Europe anymore.
So already you're basically saying that if you live in Europe, you need to buy a bunch of these, just buy them on wholesale clearance and mothball them because they'll be worth way more in 2 decades.
No one in Europe cares.
Oh, that's actually, you know what? I'm going to rebut that because I do know there is one of my suppliers is German, and he owns both a C4 Corvette, and he just bought a old Chevy Cheyenne pickup truck because he loves old American iron. So not true, actually. Anyway, carry on.
Anyway, the sales statistics disagree with him, unfortunately.
But, I mean, to be fair, those are both really old Chevys. So
yes.
But yeah, new V8s. Yeah, the LT1 is being regulated out of existence. Apparently Europe just doesn't like an engine that just screams awesome. Literally, it's not a V8 sound here. It's awesome. So I guess the reason they're being regulated out is because they create too much carbon emissions, which, I mean, it's a 6-liter V8 that's going to happen, or 6.3-liter V8. That's a lot of 6.2. Still a lot of carbon. And Europe is very heavily regulating carbon. That's the emission they are really pushing. So
a lot of the 2019 German cars got delayed because of some of the new EU restrictions coming into effect this year. So it's not just V8s. I know the Golf R, if you go on the website, is down like 10 horsepower from last year because of the new EU regulations. So GM's not the only one with this struggle, but with GM specifically, those 2 cars sell so poorly over there that they don't see it as economical to change them to meet EU specifications, because they probably can. Ford did with the Mustang. I'm pretty sure they're still selling those over there, but because they're selling terribly and because they would have to change for the regulations, they pulled them out. Which brings up the greater question of we are also, as long as our current presidency doesn't revoke all those restrictions, we are also heading towards tighter emissions restrictions. So
I actually want to jump in on that. I think even if our president does, or I guess I should say his EPA turns back emissions regulations, I get the feeling that OEMs are going to continue to work towards the current regulations, because either number one, that'll get overturned again, or actually I think more importantly, just due to cost, it'll be cheaper to develop one powertrain for worldwide than there will be to develop a US and a European version, which, I mean, that's something we've been seeing already, is you build a global platform, not just a, regional spec vehicle. So yeah, but the whole point is that V8s in general are kind of they're basically an endangered species. I mean, we already know that, like the what was it? I'm gonna totally screw this up. Was it the E92 M3 was a V8, and now it's a twin turbo or a turbo straight 6. The M5 was a V10. Now it's then it became a twin turbo V8. The trend is, or the new Ferrari, was a naturally aspirated V12. Now it's going to be a twin turbo V8. You know, the trend is smaller turbocharged engines, which, you know, I'm a fan of them. I've got one of the smallest turbocharged engines known to man in my car, but it seems like V8s in general, despite their, you know, I talk about an icon. I mean, you know, you can buy a brand new small block Chevy V8 from Chevrolet right now as a crate engine. It's like $3,500 and it's ready to go into your old muscle car. Brand new, will drop right in, everything fits. You know, it's an engine they've been making for 60 years. But and if anything, you know, the V8, the small block Chevy is as iconic to General Motors as the GM in General Motors. Like it is part of their DNA. So um, you know, I guess, you know, we're getting due for the update of all the classic American muscle cars. Specifically, in the next, I guess, 5 years, we'll definitely be seeing a new Camaro and a new Mustang. I doubt we'll ever see a new Challenger. I think that car is just going to go on until it's not possible to make them anymore. But let's let's just talk about the Mustang, because, you know, Ford especially is moving away from V8s. Do you think the next Mustang's going to have a V8? Are they even going to bother?
I think the next Shelby Mustang will have a V8.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Ford is going to do is they're going to make the V8 sort of the aspirational engine, because Ford is sort of the industry leader in pulling back on V8s. They've already successfully pulled it out of the truck market, something everyone thought they weren't going to be able to do, that no one was going to accept this V6 in their big truck. I want the V8. But the V6 is a great engine and it sells really well.
And
So
we should clarify, it's the EcoBoost V6, the twin turbo one. It's not just a. Well, I know they offer a naturally aspirated V6 too, but I think their top line engine is the twin turbo V6, isn't it?
yes, and way to throw the branding in there. So, but yes, yes, it is the EcoBoost twin turbo V6, and I think that's going to be the engine in the next Mustang. Because
And
guess
I
what?
agree
When
with that.
their
I agree
Halo
with that.
car, their Halo car has a V6, has that very same twin turbo V6.
You mean the
So
F-150, right? Or
the
the
GT.
Mustang too? Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
That's right.
the GT doesn't have a V8, so why
So
do
I've
why
kind of
would
lost track of what options go where in the Mustang lineup, because it can be kind of difficult unless you like meticulously follow it. It's difficult to it's difficult to follow that. There's a lot of options out there. But yeah,
there is.
I think you're right. There's you know, the cars that we think of being traditional V8 cars they're going to just not be able to offer it anymore, because either there's not going to be the volume there to develop a modern, you know, modern, and when I say modern, I mean a next generation V8, or the laws are just not going to allow it. See, what I think is going to happen is the V8 will continue, but it's going to be basically an aftermarket part. So, for example, you know, I talked about the small block Chevy crate motors. So, for example, the next generation Camaro, they you can buy the Camaro with a twin turbo V6. There's no V8 option, but Chevy also happens to sell a LT1 crate motor, and the wiring harness just happens to plug into your Camaro, and the engine mounts just happen to line up. It'll be one of those things where, like back in the day, if you wanted to turbocharge your car, you had to buy a kit. What I think will happen with V8s is if you want to V8 your car, you will have to do it yourself. And I think people will. There are, you know, I know that there will be V8s that are still going to be made, because, especially in racing, it is still a really good engine. It is that right balance of lots and lots of power and not a ton of weight or complexity. So I don't think V8s are ever going to go away for good. I just think they're going to move away from the mainstream. They're going to be, again, basically an aftermarket part.
I will not comment on the future GM product line.
You don't have to. You don't have to. I didn't need you to.
But speaking of V8s getting removed from vehicles, let's talk about racing, girly.
Yeah. So hybrids. the two big announcements this week. The first is the World Endurance Championship / the ACO. Le Mans was today, as we said. They finally, it took them long enough, announced the new set of rules. And of course, we need to mention the fact that the original rule set that was supposed to go into effect, actually, I think it was this year, um, was so out of touch that there had to be a mad scramble to rewrite the rules because the WEC did such a poor job of paying attention to just the world around them. They make the UAW look like geniuses. I mean, yeah, they announced these ridiculously expensive and complicated hybrid rules at the same time that Porsche was already leaving WEC, and then Audi announced not too long after they were going to do the same. So it's like, all right, you've got Toyota and nobody. And at least so they've announced the hypercar rules, which do allow for hybrids, but they're not as complicated. The World Rally Championship also announced that in 2022 they're going to have a hybrid formula. World Rallycross, which is also an FIA championship, they have talked about either doing a full electric series or being hybrid in 2022. And then there's a very strong rumor in NASCAR that their Gen 7 car could be a hybrid. And also, speaking of V8s being moved out of existence, there's a possibility that the next NASCAR might have a twin turbo V6 and not a V8, which we'll get to in a bit. But I guess what's sort of interesting to me is when Formula One first said they were going to have hybrid systems, not quite 10 years ago. I guess it was 2010 or so. Or not quite 10 years ago. There was this big backlash about, it's going to ruin the racing. Like, why are we doing this? Hybrids are just, Prius economy cars. Like, there's a big pushback that it was going to ruin the racing, and really it hasn't. And if anything, well, the current rules are different. I think just having the hybrid in general has not ruined the racing, but the but today it's like it seems almost like you have to have some kind of hybrid or electric element in your racing series in order for it to be relevant. I mean, Ford specifically has said they were not interested in the WEC or IMSA, because IMSA has also talked about being hybrid in 2022. They're not interested in those series if they're not hybrid. They want their racing to include hybrids. They want to develop, and to be fair, they want to develop hybrids for their road cars. But whereas 10 years ago it was seen as like almost somewhat toxic to want to go hybrid, these days it's almost exactly the opposite. Like, I think one of the few series that has specifically said they're not planning to go hybrid is IndyCar. And, does that make them like a dinosaur? Or are they, sort of forging their own way?
Yes.
That's actually, yeah, it's both. It is both. I appreciate that IndyCar doesn't want to go hybrid, but on the other hand, it's the way of the past.
It is, and that's kind of the funny thing. That's the thing that amuses me the most about NASCAR potentially going hybrid, which I am all for, by the way, because they get like 4 miles to the gallon. That's not even an exaggeration.
I think that's actually generous.
That's what they claim. And
under green flag conditions or yellow?
Green.
Oh, wow.
But the funny thing is, NASCAR going from where it is now to a hybrid is like going from the Model T straight to the Shelby Daytona. There's a lot in between here that we haven't gotten to, like modern transmissions or modern fuel injection. Right now they have barbaric fuel injection, but NASCAR.
How about independent rear suspension? So if NASCAR does go with hybrid, is that going to make them too much like Formula One?
Yes, and that's a good thing. But racing needs to evolve with the times, and I think endurance has done a pretty good job of that. F1 has done a really good job of that, keeping young people interested, because a lot of young people don't care that much about big burly V8s or V12s making a lot of noise. They like the
I do.
hybrids. You're not young, Curly. I hate to break
Young
that to
enough.
you.
Young enough. Young enough.
How you feel doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. Still a millennial.
But yeah, it's the way of the times. Being hybrid is being cool now. We've evolved from the time where just the Prius was a hybrid. You have a lot of performance cars that are hybrid. Therefore, a lot of racing is going to end up being hybrid. The one thing I do have to mention about the hypercar rules though is, as much as that makes me a little less uninterested in endurance, I know exactly what they're going to do. They're going to bring back the balance of power or balance of performance, and
Yeah.
they're just gonna kneecap whoever is the best, and that's not interesting to me, because the most interesting part about this regulation is who's going to come with the most badass car. And it doesn't really matter who comes with the most badass car, because that's almost bad strategically if you come out with the most badass car, and it's weird and I don't like it. But we won't get into a huge
That
discussion about balance of power. Let's not get into that.
no, and yeah, that's a very very different topic. I'll say this. I think if someone does come in with a badass car, like the two companies that have so far announced that they will participate in the hypercar rules officially are Toyota and Aston Martin. Now, Aston Martin is going to bring a proper hypercar. It's going to be a hopped up version of their Valkyrie road going hypercar, which that's pretty cool. Whereas Toyota is going to be the rules are kind of weird because they both allow for prototypes, but also road going cars. And I mean, there has to be some balancing between the two because otherwise, the full prototype is going to get blown away. And Toyota has announced what's essentially a prototype. Um, and I could see that Toyota comes in with this car and blows everybody out of the water. And I think that'll be true the first year, and then they'll really rein it in, just like Ford had with the GT. They came in with a car that was it was at the limit of the rules, and then they blew everybody's doors off, and now they've been, as you sort of said, heavily neutered um, because they were too fast. But that's also, yeah, sports car racing's they got their own interesting things. But yeah, it's interesting. I am actually I'm excited to see what comes out of these hypercar rules. And I hope it's going to be more than just the two cars that have already been announced. There's been rumors that there could be at least 2 to 3 more by the time Le Mans comes next year, which would be great. That is more manufacturers than they've had in almost a decade. But we'll see. We'll see. And I am very much in favor of racing going hybrid and electric. I mean, I've been watching Formula E this year, and in my opinion, it's probably some of the best racing out there. It's very chaotic sometimes, but it's this neat mix of strategizing your energy use, but also pushing. And they have to be very careful about balancing those two, because obviously, if you go too slow, you're going to get beat. But if you go too fast and use up all your electricity, you're not going to finish. So, um, it, that series is really coming to its own this year, and it's definitely not for everybody. But you talked about how younger people, and I hate saying it like that, but younger people aren't really interested in the big screaming V8s and V12s. Formula E has some of the best youth engagement of any racing series out there right now because it does connect. And it's not just the racing. I mean, they've done a really good job of marketing online and sort of following just modern trends in general. So, clearly, the series that a lot of people hated when it came out is really sort of growing into its own. And, you talk about manufacturer involvement. They're right up there. I think next year, I think every team is going to have an OEM behind it or damn close to it.
Yeah, and that's going to be the big thing. Everyone's getting into Formula E, so a lot of them are skipping the hybrids. But I'll kind of cap this discussion off with one thing. If Aston Martin, when they finally reveal the Valkyrie with their race car, if they don't have an advertisement or a video of all those Valkyries on the track driving around to Ride of the Valkyries, I will be very disappointed. This needs to happen. Please do it, Aston.
And let's also throw in there, make sure Max Verstappen is leading that charge.
Damn right. And a cool Red Bull looking one.
Yes.
Speaking of Red Bull, they had a terrible NASCAR team.
Yeah, NASCAR. So this is probably going to be one you talk about the most because I've watched one full race this year. It was the Daytona 500, and I'm pretty sure I slept through a good amount of stage 2. So NASCAR announced late last year a new rules package. It was going to be high downforce, the loss of the restrictor plate, and replacing it with the tapered spacer. And basically just a lot of downforce and restrictions on power at various tracks. And the results have been, we'll go with mixed, but I thought it was most poignant the rain-delayed race at Michigan, which ended up on Monday. I obviously didn't watch it, but a lot of the fans seemed to enjoy it. But I know Clint Boyer especially, he was the most vocal about how horrible the racing was. And it seems like that's been the trend is the drivers really hate the package. The fans maybe don't love it, but they're enjoying it. So, I guess as someone who actually watches the races, what do you think, first of all? And then, are the drivers right? Are the fans right? Are both right? What's going on here?
Well, I think they are both right, and I think Michigan Michigan and Charlotte have been the only cases of that sort of dichotomy where the fans really enjoy the racing, but the drivers really hate it. Because this package, it's being used on all the tracks that are over 1.25 miles or something like that to make
Basically,
sure
all the intermediate tracks.
Yeah, all those 1.5-mile tracks and bigger. And really, the only two tracks so far to really benefit from it have been Charlotte and Michigan. I have no idea why the racing was good in Charlotte. That's still confusing to this day. But Michigan, it kind of makes sense. They have those big sweeping turns. It's a very fast track. So it made sense that this sort of essentially a restrictor plate package worked out well. Now, these cars are really difficult to drive in traffic. They're they're just fine out on their own, but if you're behind a car, you will probably struggle. You will catch a little bit of a draft in the straights, but the biggest issue they've had this year is that drivers can't pass for the lead. It's something that Formula One's been struggling with all year. There's been a lot of passing in the middle to back the field, but there's just been no passing in the front, and that's frustrating to a lot of drivers because if you don't get off front on the start, which if you're going against Kyle Busch, you're probably not. And with the way their rules are set, where they have this dumb zone and the leader can start anytime in those zones. If you get the jump with that lack of power, you're gone. And that's a big issue that NASCAR is struggling with right now, that they're really having trouble with this rules package and getting someone to be able to pass for the lead because they're in that big thing of air and they don't have the power to compensate. They don't have the power to push through these high downforce cars. And it worked early on, and I think I believe Kevin Harvick predicted this at the very first All-Star race that they tested this because they had
That was a year ago or 2 years ago.
It was a year or 2 years, I forget which, but he said in the interview right after the race, he said, "Yes, this race was interesting, but I guarantee you if give these teams a few months, someone is going to figure out the best way to do it and they're going to dominate." He told everyone what was going to happen with Penske and Gibbs this year, and they have come out and they have dominated. And that's a problem NASCAR is having, and they do this all the time where they shift their rules and then a new driver and team come up and they start dominating. This happens all the time. At least we had 3 teams doing it last year, and it's a struggle because the drivers don't like this. The fans, for the most part, don't like it, and they're not even showing up anymore. The attendance is getting worse. Aside from a couple tracks, it's been bad. It's really bad.
Yeah, I'm looking at the results, and they've completed 15 races this year, and aside from one, they've all been won by a Gibbs or a Penske car. That one lone race was Chase Elliott and his Chevy. Good for Chase. way to break that mold. But yeah, it's there's been the biggest sort of ongoing debate in racing has been what's the place of downforce, because obviously wings and understanding how well there's been an understanding about aerodynamics in racing for basically ever since racing started. And it was in the late 60s that Formula One started adding wings, and then there was ground effects and things like that. And ever since then, there's been an ongoing push to increase downforce, because that makes the car quicker. But what it seems we have found is that there's a limit. You get to the point where the lead car, they get nice, clean, relatively steady air on their aerodynamic devices. But all those aerodynamic devices, they work best when they make the air turbulent. And when you have a bunch of following cars, they end up with this turbulent air, so they lose all their downforce. And that means the car has less grip, so they can't try to get a run on another driver. There's too much drag, and as you alluded to, you can't, when you're in a draft, you gain an advantage because that steady air you have to break up, and that's what the lead car does. But when you try to pull out to pass somebody, you hit the rest of that steady, stagnant air, and it's literally like running into a brick wall, or throwing a parachute. So you can't pass. And so there's been a long-standing debate about, do you add more downforce to make the cars quicker, or do you reduce the downforce and make the cars harder to drive, but they're easier to battle with? And for a long time, I really wasn't sure, but I think there's a couple of things that convinced me that you want more power and less downforce. The first is IndyCar. That's exactly what they did on the Aero kit that they introduced last year, and the racing has been really good. Yeah, occasionally you'll get a like a Barber where Takuma Sato leads almost every single lap, but his car was also spectacularly good. But then you get a race like the IndyCar Grand Prix where I think there were 5 or 6 different leaders, and with 2 laps to go, there was a very ballsy pass for the lead. Or even the Indy 500. I mean, the last dozen laps were a pretty major battle between 2 really strong cars. So, that has shown that the racing there is good. And I've also started watching a lot more oval racing on lower series, so specifically USAC Silver Crowns. And those cars have no downforce whatsoever. There's no wings, there's no under tray, nothing. And I mean, those guys will go for a dozen laps side by side, battling each other out, just trying to find who's got a little more grip and a little more speed. And it's, that's good racing. But since there's no aerodynamic devices to, be affected, then they can do that without, A, without crashing, and B, without one driver or the other having a major advantage. So, yeah, when NASCAR announced this rule package, I thought they went exactly the wrong way, much like I thought when Formula One announced their rule package a couple of years ago, the current rule package, I thought they were going the wrong way.
So I want to rebut that for a moment here, with especially when it comes to NASCAR.
Yes.
Because yes, generally if you crank down the downforce, crank up the power, that can be good. But
there's a limit to that, of course.
Yes, NASCAR has done both over the past few years. They've done in the middle, and none of it has worked. And I think the biggest issue that NASCAR has right now is they might have reached the pinnacle of their technology. And it's something that's been happening for a long time. And a lot of the good racing that you have over in IndyCar, I notice on a lot of those oval races, they are able to shift in turns, and you get that power coming out of the turns. With NASCAR, if you shift down to third gear on most oval tracks, you will blow the engine because they only have 4 gears.
That is a major issue. And actually, I agree with, I think NASCAR's biggest problem is they're trying to use they're basically duct taping modern aerodynamic devices to a very outdated car. Their biggest issue is when they try to create downforce. They're trying to create downforce with very inefficient parts. So splitters and spoilers are very. I mean, they will create downforce, but they do a very poor job of it. I think what I really hope to see out of the Gen 7 NASCAR, aside from maybe a change in engine formula and definitely more gears in the transmission, I'd like to see a complete rethink of how they manage the air in and around the car. So, for example, and without getting too into the tech of NASCAR or just aerodynamics in general, when the air hits the front of a NASCAR right now, it has to go around the car and through the grill. Well, the air going through the grill actually goes under the car, which creates lift. That's bad. The underside of the car is not a flat bottom, which creates a ton of turbulence. That creates lift. And when they talk about side drafting and side force, it's because this air under the car is spilling out. It is not moving cleanly down the car. It's just sort of billowing around, and that's where you get these side draft effects that sort of ruin the passing. So they've taken a car that the ideas behind it are sort of stuck back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but they're trying to make them competitive in a modern day. So really, they need a complete rethink of how they make the aerodynamics. Get rid of the splitters, get rid of the spoilers, create a good under tray that actually creates the downforce you need, vent the front end properly so that it's not creating, because actually if you vent the air up, like you see in a lot of like you see in all the major sports cars and both road and racing cars, that creates downforce. But if you vent it down, it creates lift. It's a very simple concept. So if when NASCAR creates the Gen 7 car, they really need to understand how the air goes over and under and through the car. And if they can get that right, even with the exact same amount of horsepower they have now, the racing would be a lot better. I do want to see them reduce the downforce by quite a lot. The fact that the way that the cars are set up right now is so ridiculous. They've got a ton of camber in the right front. They're practically dragging the splitter on the front of the ground. You can design the car so you don't need to do those things.
Not practically, they do.
Yeah, I mean, but you can design a car that you don't have to do that and still make it handle really well. So,
but that is all. I think that's all going to be for naught if they don't improve the bones. If they don't improve the suspension dynamics, which given have gotten a lot better, if they don't improve the chassis, if they don't improve the transmissions, this is all going to be for naught.
Yeah, I definitely want to see 6 speeds. I think the fact that they still use a 4-speed transmission is just stupid.
I think skip that. The big argument has been for durability.
Mm-hmm.
ZF makes an 8-speed that can handle 800 horsepower.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a ton of, Hollinger makes a really good sequential 6-speed. I mean, there's a ton of transmissions out there that would do the job. I do want to see them stick with manual transmissions. I do think that is part of the allure of NASCAR, even though I know manual transmissions are dying, but it's still something I like them to see. But definitely, they need more than 4 speeds. You could make all this work. Actually, no, you really do need independent suspension to make a flat bottom car work, because right now you've got this giant cast iron tube that the air has to go around. And you either have to make the floor go under it, which you could do, but it's kind of stupid, or you could just not have it there.
Yeah, and I'll kind of close out this discussion with NASCAR really needs to think about what they're doing. It's an issue among a lot of racing series, among a lot of sports, that they try as hard as they can to hold on to the diehards, but the diehards are getting old. They need new diehards, and people aren't going to understand when they look into NASCAR and they be like, "What these archaic monsters driving around ovals? How is this interesting?" They need to modernize, and they need to modernize soon.
So NASCAR tried to do that. They've tried to do that over the last, from 2000 on, when their popularity really skyrocketed. They abandoned a lot of their longtime tracks, or if they didn't abandon them, they really reduced. They went from 2 races to 1 at like Darlington. They've abandoned Rockingham. all the NASCAR stalwart tracks. They've tried to clean up their image. You went from a field of good old boys. I remember there's a Jeff Foxworthy joke where he talks about when you listen to a NASCAR interview after the race, you don't want to understand what they're able to say. Like, that's how you know you've got a proper NASCAR driver. Like, he says, Jeff Gordon, the reason everybody hates him is because he enunciates. So they've tried that, and it worked for a while, but now there's the fans that they attracted in that time period are sort of leaving. So, I guess the way I look at it is I read a great quote by Richard Petty that actually got adapted specifically to this topic. It was from Kyle Petty. He was talking about where NASCAR is, and he said, if you don't know how you're lost if you don't know how you got there. So NASCAR got all this really big success. They were, all starting to worry the NFL with their popularity. And it seems like they're not really sure how they got there. And now that things are starting to slip and they're going on the backside of that peak, they're not sure how to get it back again. So I think overall NASCAR, you're right. They really do need to they need to figure out what they are and what they want to be. They can't just be a regional series. They can't just be a niche series. They really need to figure out what people want and what they like. And the cars are a big part of it, and the racing and just in general, everything. It all ties together.
They're always afraid of pissing off the diehards, and to grow and to have success, you cannot worry that much about pissing off the diehards because they're diehards for a reason. They will probably stay. Even if you push them away, if you can get new fans, that's more important because they're going to help you into the future.
Oh, and the diehards, I mean, the type of people who say, well, I'm not going to watch NASCAR if they don't got a 6-speed or a hybrid, they'll keep watching. I mean, how many people, we haven't talked about it, and I don't want to go too far into it. How many people went onto Twitter after the Canada Formula One race and said, I'm never going to watch Formula One again? And how many of those accounts are going to say, wow, the French Grand Prix was awesome next Sunday? Probably most of them. Yeah, because people will say, oh, I'm never going to watch a series again. And then they do anyway because they still like the series. So you're right. Don't worry about pissing people off. I mean, to an extent. But if you're trying to hang on to people who are not going to be the future of your sport, you're doing it wrong. You need to. I mean, you don't want to make them too upset, but that should not be your primary goal. You need to look into the future and move towards the future. So, yeah, NASCAR needs a good hard look everywhere, top to bottom.
And maybe a sale is going to help that. It's
we'll
possible. The Francis have talked about it, but
I read Robin Miller, who writes for Racer Magazine and does part of the IndyCar telecasts. He wrote a really good editorial this week that NASCAR and IndyCar need to start doing double headers at ovals. And his specific example was Texas. He goes, the last NASCAR race at Texas was pretty good, but they're no longer able to fill the grandstands. IndyCar, their turnout was pretty pathetic. It's basically, he said, people don't want to come out to 2 races a year, so make them come out to one. You do one series on Saturday, one on Sunday. I sort of thought about that. I mean, I think that's a great idea. I actually thought, let's keep going with that. Like, bring out some USAC Silver Crowns or some super modifieds, or even just regular NASCAR modifieds. Those are a lot of fun to watch too. Basically make it a whole weekend of just nothing but oval racing from, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday should just be jam-packed with tons and tons of oval racing because it can be really, really good. But if nobody's watching it, then it doesn't matter. And there's a ton of really great oval racing out there. And, racing in general is getting to a point where you can't just be factional anymore. You can't just say, well, NASCAR is the best, everything else sucks. You really have to adapt. And that's part of changing with the times, is understanding that you cannot hold a monopoly on this if you want to survive.
Nope. And racing as a whole has to change. I think that's been the theme of this podcast, and we've talked a lot about racing once again. It's been fun.
Yeah, but to be fair, we also talked for quite a while about unions, which was pretty interesting too. And to be honest, I think there's a lot more we could have gone into on unions, just how the dynamics of them and how they affect, car sales and the car market. So, but
Save
it's
that for
also
an even
fun.
slower news week.
Yeah, but it's also fun to talk about racing. So, I guess that's been our show. Thank you all for watching. I guess as always, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are held by those of the hosts only, and not by their respective companies or supporters or whatever, or other people we even know. And like, subscribe, etc., etc.
All those
And
thingies.
yep, all those standard internet thingy mobs. And we'll see you guys again in a week. Thank you.
See ya.